The hall smelled of pine sap and lamp oil. Outside the windows, the wind moved against the church, the way wind moves against a thing it intends to test all winter. Inside, the Ladies' Aid had laid the long table with cider and biscuits and a roast goose that Lavinia Trumbull had brought from her own kitchen and made certain everyone knew. She stood now with her cider raised. She wore lavender silk and jet buttons and a gracious smile. "To our newest neighbor," Lavinia said, "our brave little chicken widow, who has promised us so very much. We do all hope she lasts until spring." The laughter came polite and small, like coins set down on a counter. Hattie Crane stood at the kitchen door with a tray of biscuits in her hands. The wooden egg was in her apron pocket. She felt the weight of it against her hip. She did not answer. She set the tray down on the long table. She walked back through the kitchen door, and she did the next thing. If you have ever been written off in a room full of people who smiled while they did it, stay with me. This story is for you. Tap the like button so it reaches the right ears tonight. Subscribe so you don't lose the channel. And tell me in the comments what town you are listening from. I want to know how far this story has traveled. Now let us go back to where it all began. She was 33 years old the autumn she stood on the platform at Bitter Fork, Wyoming territory, with 2 trunks and $43 and her mother's wooden egg in her apron pocket. Reuben Crane had been dead 14 months by then. The plow horse rolled in the spring planting and crushed him before he could draw breath. And Hattie had run across the half-turned field with her skirts gathered and her chest gone hollow. And when she reached him, he was already past hearing her say his name. That was the end of the farm, too, though she did not know it that day. The bank had been polite about waiting. Banks always were, at first. By the second harvest, there was no harvest. Only the note coming due, and a man in a clean coat who said he was sorry, and the sale of the wagon, and the milk cow, and the rocking chair her mother had given her, and a final figure of $43 and 2 trunks, and nowhere to put them down. She had one inheritance. Not the rocking chair, not the land. Pearl Whitlow, her mother, had run a flock of 400 laying hens in Cedar County, Iowa, for 30 years. And from the time Hattie could carry a basket, she had been taught everything Pearl knew. The breeds: Plymouth Rocks for cold, Leghorns for laying, Wyandottes for both. The winter ventilation that kept lungs clear without bleeding off heat. The candling of an egg by lamp to see what lived inside it. The water glass preservation that held a summer's eggs sound until February. The way a broody hen will sometimes need a wooden egg slipped under her to keep her settled while the real eggs travel to market. That wooden egg was the one Pearl had kept on her kitchen windowsill her whole working life. It was the one Pearl had pressed into Hattie's hand the week before Pearl died of pleurisy in the winter of '82. Pale ash, palm-sized, smooth as river stone from 40 years of handling. It was the only thing Hattie carried that the bank could not name a price for. She had answered the advertisement in the 3rd week of September. It ran in the Western Homesteader's Gazette and read, "Wanted, widow, healthy, capable with poultry, Wyoming homestead, practical terms." The reply came 3 weeks later. It was 3 sentences long. "My name is Caleb Brenner. I have 2 children and a failing flock. I cannot promise more than honest work and a roof. If that is enough, the 11 o'clock train, October 14th. It was enough. She sold the rocking chair, too. Bitter Fork was a single street and a depot and a feed store and a mercantile and a church. Set down in the bowl of a wide valley, with the Wind River Range standing white and indifferent along the western edge of the sky. The train pulled out and Hattie stood with her trunks and watched the platform empty around her, the way platforms do, in pairs and threes, husbands and brothers and hired men with wagons. And after a while, there was no one but herself and her breath in the October air. He did not come. She had half expected that after a quarter hour, a small wagon came up the rutted street, drawn by a sway-backed bay. An old man held the reins. A girl of about 9 sat beside him, with her hands folded over a slate, and a boy of about 6 sat between them, with his chin tucked into the collar of a too big coat. The old man drew the wagon up beside the platform and looked her over without hurry, the way a man looks at weather. "You'd be Mrs. Crane." "I am." "Ezra Pell. I work the place." He'd have come, but a calf went the wrong direction this morning, and he's the only one can get it back. "These are his." The girl said her name, Willa. The boy did not say anything. He watched Hattie the way a small animal watches the door of a barn it has not yet been carried into. "Much obliged," Hattie said. Ezra got down and put the trunks in the bed of the wagon and helped her up beside the boy. He took the reins and clucked at the bay, and they moved out of town along a road that climbed up into the breaks above the river. The wind came off the snow on the high country, and Hattie felt it find every seam of her coat. "How far?" she said. 6 miles. Lark Hollow. He took it up in 79. Ezra glanced sidelong at her. "You ought to know going in. The coop went down in a wind 2 springs back. Hasn't been more than 4 hens at Lark Hollow since—" "I expected something like that." "Did you—" he said, failing in his letter. I took him at his word. Ezra clucked at the bay again. The boy beside her shifted closer in a way she did not think he meant to, and Willa watched the road and did not blink. Lark Hollow showed itself across a low rise of brown grass and rabbit brush, a long, low cabin with a sod-thickened roof, a barn that needed paint, a windmill turning slow against the white sky. And off to the south of the house, the wreck of what had been a chicken coop, the long side rafters folded down into the run, and a tangle of chicken wire on top of them, and the door hanging open, and 4 lean hens scratching listlessly at the dust outside. Hattie counted them. 1, 2, 3, 4. She did not say anything yet. A man came out of the barn. He was tall and broad through the shoulders and walked the way a tired man walks who has decided to keep walking anyway. He had dark hair gone early silver at the temples and a face the wind had been working on for a long time. He stopped beside the wagon and took off his hat. "Mrs. Crane, Mr. Renner, I would have come. Mr. Pell told me." He looked at her for a moment longer than he had to. He looked like a man trying to take the measure of a thing he had committed to before he understood it. Then he reached up and helped her down, and his hand was warm through her glove. "The children have eaten," he said. "There's stew. Ezra will bring the trunks." He led her in. The cabin was clean and bare. A kitchen with a black iron stove and a long pine table. A windowsill above the wash basin that caught the afternoon light. 2 doors off the back. A photograph on the mantel of a young woman with a child in her lap, which Hattie did not look at twice that first afternoon. Caleb stood in the kitchen doorway and did not seem to know what to say next. Hattie took her apron from the trunk Ezra carried in. She tied it on. She drew the wooden egg from her coat pocket. She crossed the kitchen. She set the wooden egg on the windowsill above the basin, where the afternoon light caught its pale ash and made it look almost lit from inside. She did not explain. He did not ask. "I'll start tomorrow," she said. That was all she said that first day. She started before light. She woke in the small back room Caleb had given her and dressed in the dark by feel, the way a woman does in a house she does not yet trust the floorboards of. She lit a lamp. She found the kitchen stove going low and stoked it and set the kettle. She put on the coffee. By the time the kettle whistled, she had been to the privy and back, and the eastern sky was the color of skim milk along the bottom edge. She walked out to the coop. The cold went straight through her coat and her shawl both. The 4 hens were huddled together under what was left of the leeward rafter, and one of them, a pale buff cochin with a froze-shut eye, did not so much as lift her head when Hattie crouched beside her. "All right," Hattie said. She did not say it to the hen. She said it to herself, the way her mother had said it for 40 years. The morning prayer of women who run flocks. All right. We see what we have. We work with what we have. She walked the wreck of the coop with her hands in her coat pockets and her breath white in front of her. She marked the salvageable boards in her mind. The west wall was sound. 2 rafters could be reused if she pulled the bent nails and straightened them. The chicken wire was rusted to lace and would have to come off. The door had a good hinge yet. She fed the 4 hens what little cracked corn she found in a feed sack inside the barn. She carried the buff cochin into the kitchen and laid her in a basket lined with rags beside the stove. Caleb came in from the barn while she was doing that. He stopped in the doorway and looked at the hen, and looked at Hattie, and looked at the stove. He reached past her and opened the damper. He did not ask. She did not explain. The buff cochin lived through the night. By Friday, word had reached town that the new Renner woman was repairing a coop in October with a bent claw hammer and a 6-year-old boy holding her nails. By Saturday, the visits began. Martha Kyle rode out first. Martha ran the boarding house at the south end of Bitter Fork and was, by general agreement, the most practical woman in 3 counties. She came in a buckboard with a covered basket of dried apples and a cheese, and she set them on the kitchen table and looked at Hattie across them with the kindly thoroughness of a woman about to deliver bad news. "Child," Martha said, "I have been 41 years in this country. I have seen 6 women try to start a flock in a Wyoming fall. None of them carried it through. You will freeze by Christmas." Hattie thanked her for the apples and the cheese. She poured Martha coffee. She did not argue. She walked Martha back out to the buckboard when she was done, and Martha looked once more at the coop where Ezra and Caleb were laying down the salvaged west wall, and she shook her head and clucked her tongue and drove away. Hattie went back to the coop. She picked up a board. She laid it in. 1 board. Then the next board. Tuesday she rode into Bitter Fork with Ezra for nails and tar paper and a roll of new chicken wire. Doc Harrow was in the Mercantile, arguing with the proprietor about quinine. He turned when she came in. He was a thin, sandy man with spectacles, and he had read books, and he wanted her to know it. "Mrs. Crane," he said. A word of professional kindness. Hens do not lay below 35 degrees. That is established science. Wyoming territory is not Iowa. I would not see you embarrassed in the spring. "Much obliged for the science, Doctor." She bought the tar paper. She bought the chicken wire. She bought 12 pounds of cracked corn and 4 pounds of oyster shell and a small tin of pine tar for the purchase. She paid out of the $43 and the small wages Caleb had pressed into her hand on Monday morning, and Doc Harrow watched her pay. And then he tipped his hat with the careful sorrow of a man who had warned a woman in good time. Out on the street, Reverend Abel Finch was waiting. He had heard she was in town. He was a soft-voiced man with a square, clean collar, and he had pondered the matter, he said, and he wished to suggest that Mrs. Crane might more properly take a room at Mrs. Kyle's boarding house until such time as the engagement was sanctified before God and the congregation. It was, he said, the seemly arrangement. Hattie thanked Reverend Finch for his concern. She climbed up into the wagon beside Ezra. That same afternoon, in Lavinia Trumbull's parlor on Front Street, the Ladies' Aid Sewing Circle was bent over a charity quilt. Mrs. Trumbull poured the tea herself. She waited until every cup was filled. Then she said, in the low, warm voice she used for the sweetest cuts, "The previous Mrs. Renner kept the loveliest little flock, white leghorns. Such a shame nothing has thrived out at Lark Hollow since." She set the teapot down. "We must all," she said, "be very gentle with the new one." Hattie heard about the sewing circle on Thursday. Ezra heard it from the smith, and the smith had heard it from his wife, who had been at the table when Lavinia poured. He told Hattie at the woodpile while she was splitting kindling for the morning fire, and he told her the way an old man tells a young woman a thing he believes she ought to know, without believing she ought to do anything about it. "Mrs. Trumbull said gentle," Ezra said. "That's the word she used. I heard you. You ought to know who runs that aid society." "I know. The banker's wife." Ezra leaned on the maul. "Her husband holds your paper." Hattie set another round on the chopping block and split it clean. She set the halves aside. She picked up another round. "I heard you, Mr. Pale." "All right, then." He went back to the barn. She split kindling until the basket was full, and she carried it in, and she stoked the kitchen stove, and she set a pot of beans to soak. She did not mention the sewing circle to Caleb. She did not mention it to the children. She picked up the salvaged west wall plank from where Ezra had stacked it inside the kitchen door, and she carried it back out to the coop. She laid it in one board, then the next board. By the end of the second week, she and Ezra had the coop framed back to square. Caleb had said almost nothing through the framing. He came over from the cattle work in the late afternoons and held one end of a board while she nailed the other. He pulled bent nails out of the salvage pile and straightened them on the flat of an anvil and dropped them in a tin can. When she dropped a hammer in the dust, he picked it up and handed it to her, and his hand did not touch hers. He did not ask what she was doing about Doc Harrow's 35 degrees. He did not ask about Reverend Finch. She thought sometimes he wanted to ask, and then thought better of it. On the third Sunday, Willa came out to the coop while Hattie was tarring the seams of the north wall against the wind. Willa carried a tin cup of water. She did not say what it was for. She held it out at arm's length, and Hattie took it, and Hattie drank, and Hattie gave it back, and Willa stood for a while with her slate hugged against her chest, watching Hattie work the tar brush into the seam. "Mama painted the inside white," Willa said. It was the first sentence the child had spoken directly to her. "Did she?" Hattie said. "She said it made the hens think it was mourning longer." "Your mama was right. We'll do that too, in the spring." Willa nodded once. She walked back to the house with the empty tin cup. From the kitchen door, Tommy watched her come, and he watched Hattie behind her. And when his sister went in, he stood another long moment in the doorway before he went in too. That night, Hattie wrote one line in the back of the small ledger she had begun keeping. "The first hen will lay in February if we do the work now." She closed the book. She put it in the drawer of the kitchen table beside a leather-bound book she had not yet opened, and the spine of which read in Caleb's wife's handwriting, "Coop Book, Eliza Renner." She did not open it. It snowed the second week of November. Not a serious snow, the kind that came in the night and was already going by mid-morning. But it was the first hard cold of the season, and the buff Cochin, who had spent her recovery beside the kitchen stove, was out in the new coop now, and Hattie stood in the kitchen at 4 a.m. with a lantern in one hand and looked out the window at the dark and listened. She heard nothing wrong. She put on her coat. The new coop was tight. She had filled the south wall with hay between the planking and the inner wall, and she had banked straw bales along the windward foundation, and she had put a hinged board over the pop door that could be dropped at sundown. The 4 old hens were on the new perches. The buff Cochin sat closest to the wall, fluffed, her one good eye open and bright. Hattie stood inside the coop with the lantern lifted and made herself look at every corner. She listened to the breathing of the 4 birds. She checked the water. She had set the waterer on a flat stone over a low pan of warmed sand she changed at midnight, an old Pearl Whitlow trick that bought you 4 hours of unfrozen drinking water in a Wyoming November. She walked back to the house. The lantern threw her shadow long across the dust of the dooryard. The eastern sky was lightening enough to show the line of the hills. Caleb was at the kitchen table when she came in. He had pulled on his boots without his coat. He had not lit a lamp. He was sitting in the half-dark with both hands wrapped around a tin cup of coffee, and he looked up when she came in. "All 4, she said. He nodded once. He pushed a second tin cup across the table toward her. She sat down. She drank. He did not say what he had been doing up at 4 a.m. She did not ask. They sat with their 2 cups of coffee and the kitchen stove ticking as it warmed. And after a while she said, "I'd like to bring in more hens. There's a German woman south of town, Mrs. Voss. You know her. My wife knew her. She might sell some birds, if we can get out there before the first real snow." He turned the tin cup in his hands. "I'll take you Wednesday." "All right." He took a slow breath, and the breath caught somewhere in him, and he said quietly, "Mrs. Crane." "Yes?" "The advertisement said practical terms. I meant that you don't owe this place more than honest work." She watched him across the table. She watched the way his hands held the cup, as if it were something he was afraid of dropping. "I know what the advertisement said. Mr. Renner." "All right. I'm not building a flock for honest work. I'm building a flock because that is what I know how to do." He nodded. He looked down into the cup. "All right," he said again. He stood up. He took his coat from the peg. He went out to the barn. She sat with a second tin cup of coffee until the eastern sky had turned the color of bone. And then she got up and started breakfast. She opened Eliza Renner's coop book on a Tuesday night by lamplight, after the children had gone to bed. She did it because she had been about to start a separate Lark Hollow ledger, and she had thought, the night before, of the leather book in the drawer, and she had thought, lying in the small back room with the wind at the window. There are things in there I should know. She opened it on her own initiative. She did not tell Caleb. The handwriting was small and careful. Eliza Renner had kept her flock the way a serious woman keeps a flock. The breeds the pullets had begun to lay, the weights of the eggs, the bloodlines of the broody hens. A page of notes in pencil about a particular hen named Speckle, who had hatched 3 clutches a season for 4 years, and a small dried 4-leaf clover pressed flat between that page and the next. Hattie read the book through twice. She closed it. She put it back in the drawer. The next morning she walked out to the coop in the dawn cold and looked at the 4 hens on their perches, and she saw which one was the old line of Speckle's daughters. She marked the bird in her mind. She would breed back to that line in the spring. She did not mention any of this to Caleb. She did not need to. The flock was the flock. The line was the line. It would tell its own story by April. The Voss place sat in a fold of the hills 6 miles south of Bitter Fork. They went on Wednesday in the wagon. The boy Tommy came along because he had asked, quietly and only once, and Caleb had looked at him and then at Hattie, and lifted him up into the wagon without a word. Tommy sat between them, with his too big coat buttoned to his chin and his hands in his pockets, and for the first 3 miles he did not say anything. Mrs. Voss met them at her gate. She was a wide, square woman with a kerchief tied under her chin and an accent thick enough to stand a spoon in. Her flock ran in a yard behind the barn, 60 birds at least, fat and busy in the cold, scratching the bare ground for the cracked rye she had just thrown down. She walked Hattie around them. She talked breeds in 3 languages. Hattie picked out 18 birds, 12 pullets and 6 hens of laying age, Plymouth Rocks and Wyandottes, mostly, with 2 light Brahmas for the deep cold. She named her price. Mrs. Voss named hers. They settled it in less than 4 minutes. Mrs. Voss watched the way Hattie handled the birds, the way her hands closed around the wings to fold them without pinning, the way she felt under the breast for the spread of the pelvic bones. And at the end, Mrs. Voss said in her thick voice, "You learned from somebody good." "My mother." "Where?" "Iowa, Cedar County, Pearl Whitlow, Mrs." Voss looked at her. "I know that name. She wrote to the Gazette She wrote about the brooding boxes." Mrs. Voss nodded slowly. "Good, good. Tell Caleb Renner he is lucky." She did not say it for Caleb to hear. Caleb was at the wagon untying the crate. She said it for Hattie, in the yard, between the 2 of them, and then she turned and went to fetch a sack of her own cracked rye to send along as a gift. On the way home, Tommy fell asleep against Hattie's side. He did not seem to know he was doing it. He listed slowly sideways as the wagon climbed the long grade up out of the south breaks. And after a mile, his head was against her arm, and his small mouth was open, and his breathing was the deep, regular breathing of a child who has decided in his sleep that he is safe. Caleb saw it. He did not move the boy. He did not look across at Hattie. He kept the reins loose in his hands and his eyes on the bay's ears. And he drove the wagon home through the late afternoon light, the way a man drives a wagon when he is trying not to disturb something. Hattie rested her hand on the boy's shoulder. She let him sleep. If this story has reached you tonight, leave one word in the comments. Stayed. So I know who is still here. Now back to it. The sewing circle had been on a Tuesday. By the 3rd week of November, Lavinia Trumbull was no longer pouring tea about the Renner widow. She was writing letters. The first letter went to the Reverend Finch. It was a letter of Christian concern. It mentioned the impropriety of an unmarried woman residing under the roof of a widower with 2 young children, regardless of the matrimonial advertisement. It suggested gently that a chat from the pulpit might be in order. It was signed Mrs. Nathan Trumbull, trustee, Bitter Fork Methodist. The second letter went to her husband. It was a short letter. It pointed out in 2 sentences that the Lark Hollow note had been carried 6 months past its due date as a kindness, and that a kindness extended too long became, in the world of banking, a habit. Hattie did not know about the letters. What she knew was that Reverend Finch came out to Lark Hollow on the last Saturday of November. He drove out alone in his light buggy. He came at the noon hour. Hattie was at the kitchen table teaching Willa how to candle an egg by holding it in front of the open door of the lit lamp. The girl held the egg the way Hattie had shown her, with her thumb and 2 fingers on the long axis, and she turned it slowly, and Hattie was saying, "There, you see, that dark spot? That is a yolk that has set. That is a good egg. We mark it." The Reverend knocked. Hattie set the egg down. She wiped her hands on her apron. She opened the door. The Reverend was very polite. He asked if Mr. Renner was at home. Caleb was in the barn. Hattie went to fetch him. The conversation was held in the kitchen, with Hattie and the 2 children present. The Reverend would not sit down. He spoke of the propriety of the arrangement. He spoke of the appearance to the congregation. He spoke of the importance of the marriage being solemnized without further delay, if it was to be solemnized at all, and of the difficulty of his position if it was not. Caleb listened to him with his hat in his hands. When the Reverend was done, Caleb said, "Mrs. Crane and I have an arrangement. It will be solemnized. I will tell you, when the Reverend allowed that the date was a matter for the couple to decide, he allowed that there were, however, certain expectations." He bowed to Hattie. He drove away. Hattie shut the door. She went back to the table. She picked up the unmarked egg. She held it in front of the lamp. She turned it slowly. "There," she said to Willa. "You see? That is the air cell at the wide end. We want it small." Willa looked at her, and then at the egg, and then at her father, who had not put his hat back on, and who was standing at the kitchen window, looking out at the place in the dooryard where the Reverend's buggy had been. "There," Willa said quietly. "I see it." Hattie marked the egg with a small pencil cross and set it in the basket of the good ones. That night, after the children were in bed, and Caleb had gone out to bank the barn against a cold front coming, Ezra came in for his coffee. He always came in for his coffee at 9 o'clock. He sat at the kitchen table with his bad legs straight out and accepted the tin cup she poured for him. He drank slowly. He set the cup down. He looked at her across the table. "You ought to know," Ezra said, "what happened in this house." Hattie sat down opposite him. "All right," she said. "Eliza Renner died in this kitchen 4 years ago come January. Childbirth. The baby was a girl. She did not last the night either. There was a snowstorm. Doc Harrow could not get out from town in time. By the time he got here at dawn, Eliza had been gone 6 hours, And Caleb was sitting in that chair you're sitting in, holding the baby. Hattie did not move. For 2 years after, Ezra said, Caleb did not say more than 10 words in a day. Not to me, not to Willa, not to the boy. The flock his wife had built, 60 layers, prize leghorns, the best in the county. They died one by one through that first winter because he could not bear to go into the coop. The 4 hens you came to were the last 4. They were tough birds. They lived because they were tough. Ezra picked up the tin cup. I tell you this, he said, because he will not, and you ought to know what you are standing in the middle of. Thank you, Mr. Powell. I am only an old man telling an honest woman a true thing. I know. He drank the last of his coffee. He set the cup down. He got up slowly, favoring the bad leg, and he took his hat from the peg, and he went out to the bunkhouse for the night. Hattie sat alone at the kitchen table for a long while. Then she got up. She went to the windowsill above the wash basin. She picked up the wooden egg in her palm. She held it. She did not say anything to it. She put it back down. She banked the stove for the night. She turned down the lamp. She went to her small back room. She lay in the dark and listened to the wind start to come up against the south wall of the cabin. And she thought about a woman she had never met, dying in a kitchen on a January night 4 years ago. And she thought about a man sitting in a chair, holding a baby, who had not lasted the night. And she thought about 4 tough hens who had outlived 60 better ones, because no one had been able to bear to go in and care for them. She did not cry. She did the next thing. She closed her eyes and made herself sleep, because morning was 4 hours away, and there were 47 hens at Lark Hollow now, and they would need her at first light. By the first week of December, the new coop held 47 birds, and the 4 old hens were laying again. The buff cochin with the once-froze eye laid her first egg of the season on the morning of December 2nd. Hattie found it in the corner nest box at 6 in the morning, warm in her palm, brown and small and perfect. She set it in the basket. She did not say anything to anyone. She walked back to the kitchen and put the egg on the table beside the breadboard and started breakfast. Caleb came in from the barn. He stopped at the table. He looked at the single brown egg on the breadboard. That the buff? Yes. He looked at the egg a moment longer. He hung up his coat. He sat down. He did not say what was in his face. She did not ask him to. By the 2nd week of December, the morning count was 7. By the 3rd week, it was 15. By the morning of the 21st of December, Willa counted 23 eggs out loud at the kitchen table, lining them up in 3 rows on a folded dish towel, her braids falling forward over her shoulders as she set each one down. Tommy stood at her elbow and watched. He could not yet count to 23, and so he counted by pointing. Caleb was halfway out of his coat in the kitchen doorway. He stopped, with one arm in the sleeve and one arm out. He watched his daughter line up the eggs. He did not speak. He finished taking off the coat. He hung it on the peg. That's the morning, Hattie said. There'll be more by noon. 23, he said. 23 this morning. He sat down at the table. He looked at the eggs the way a man looks at a thing he has been afraid to hope for. Then he reached out and slid one of them, very carefully, with the side of his hand, into the line, so that the rows were even. He did not say anything else. He did not have to. In the second week of December, Hattie went into the feed store to settle the month's account. The store was warm. There were 2 men by the stove drinking coffee out of tin cups. One was a hired man off the Trumbull place named Boggs. The other was a teamster she did not know. She came in with the buffalo robe still pulled up around her chin, and she set her basket on the counter, and she nodded to Mr. Calloway, who kept the store, and waited for him to bring her ledger out. Boggs looked across at the teamster. He spoke loud enough to carry. That'd be her, the Iowa hen witch. The teamster laughed. Out at Lark Hollow, Boggs said. Renner married her by mail. Whole town's waiting to see whether she eats them or they eat her. 23 eggs a morning. I heard, the teamster said. You heard wrong. Hattie did not turn around. She kept her hands on the counter. She watched Mr. Calloway come back with the ledger. Mr. Calloway had heard it too. He set the ledger down. He cleared his throat. He was about to say something to the 2 by the stove. He did not have to. The door opened behind her, and Caleb came in. He was unbuttoning his coat as he came. He had been across the street at the Smiths. He stopped just inside the door. He looked at Boggs. He looked at the teamster. He did not raise his voice. Mrs. Crane is mine to speak of, he said. You will not. He said it the way a man drives a fence post. Once, square. Boggs looked at him. Boggs opened his mouth, and then he shut it again, because he was a hired man on a Trumbull paycheck, and he could read a face. And Caleb Renner's face had become a thing in that quarter year that you read with care. No offense meant, Mr. Renner. I take none, Caleb said, and there'll be none given. Good day, Boggs. Boggs touched the brim of his hat. He went back to his coffee. The teamster studied his cup. Caleb did not look at Hattie. He went to the dry goods shelf and pretended to consider lamp wicks. Hattie settled her account with Mr. Calloway. She paid in eggs and in coin. Mr. Calloway took the eggs with both hands as a man takes a thing of value. She put the change in her coat pocket and lifted her basket and walked out. In the wagon on the way home, she did not mention it. Neither did Caleb. Ezra told her about it 3 days later at the woodpile. He spoke for you in town. I know. He has not spoken for anyone in 4 years. I know, Mr. Pell. Ezra leaned on the maul. He looked at her with the watery directness of an old man who had decided long ago that the truth cost less than the lie. I just wanted you to know that I know. Thank you. She picked up another round of pine. She set it on the block. She split it clean. The fall in the snow happened on December the 18th. It was a cold, dry day. The kind of day that makes you forget the season has teeth in it. Hattie was carrying a basket of laundry from the line into the kitchen, and her boot heel caught on the iced-over hump of a wagon rut in the dooryard, and she went down hard on her right hip and one elbow. She lay there for a half-second. The basket of frozen sheets had gone in the opposite direction. She heard the kitchen door open. Tommy came across the dooryard in his stocking feet. He did not say anything. He bent down and put one small hand under her elbow and one against her shoulder, and he tried, with the whole of his 6-year-old strength, to lift her. He could not. He kept trying. Tommy, she said. He kept trying. Tommy, I am not hurt. Let me sit a moment. He stopped trying to lift her. He sat down in the snow beside her instead, He put his small, mittened hand on top of her gloved hand. He did not look at her. He looked at the kitchen door. "Mama fell down," he said. It was so quiet she nearly missed it. "What did you say, Tommy?" "In the snow." "Mama fell down in the snow," they said, before. Hattie did not move. She did not breathe for a moment. "Tommy," she said, "look at me, sweetheart." He looked at her. "I fell on the ice, that is all. I am going to get up now. I am going to pick up the basket. I am going to take the sheets inside. Then I am going to make you a hot cup of milk with honey, because you came out in your stocking feet, and I love you for it." But it was a foolish thing to do. He looked at her with his wet eyes. "You will be there," he said, "when the milk is done. I will be there when the milk is done. And tomorrow, and the day after." The cold doesn't care who laughed. Sweetheart, it only asks who got ready. And we got ready. We are ready. He nodded once. He stood up. He picked up 2 of the frozen sheets out of the snow with great gravity and carried them toward the kitchen door. She got up slowly. Her hip hurt. She did not care. She picked up the basket and the rest of the sheets, and she followed him in. That night, when she banked the kitchen stove for the night, she stood for a long time at the windowsill, with her palm flat over the wooden egg, not picking it up, just holding her hand over it. Then she went to her room. She did not sleep until after 1. The harvest social was on the 22nd of December. It was held in the Methodist Church Hall, which was the only hall in Bitterfork big enough to hold the town. The Ladies' Aid had laid the long table with cider and biscuits and the roast goose from Lavinia Trumbull's kitchen. There were candles in the windows and a fiddler from the Voss place tuning by the stove. Hattie did not want to go. She went because Willa wanted to go. Willa had been working on a Christmas hymn for the children's recitation for 3 weeks. She knew her verse by heart. She had practiced it for Hattie in the kitchen on 5 separate evenings. She wanted to wear her brown wool dress with the cream lace collar her mother had sewn before she died. And she wanted Hattie to braid her hair in the long single braid down her back that her mother had braided. And she wanted Tommy to wear his good boots. And she wanted her father to come. And she wanted Hattie to come. So they went. The hall was warm. The smell of the goose came at the door. Lavinia Trumbull stood at the head of the long table in her lavender silk and jet buttons, and she greeted them with the smile of a woman whose evening was about to go exactly to plan. "Mrs. Crane," she said, "how brave of you to come. And Caleb, and the dear children." Caleb said good evening. Mrs. Trumbull. Hattie said good evening. Willa said her piece at the children's recitation in a small, clear voice. She did not stumble. Tommy stood next to her with his hands clasped in front of him and looked at the floor. When the children sat down, Hattie put her arm around Tommy's shoulders and squeezed once, and Willa leaned across her brother's lap and laid her hand briefly on Hattie's knee. The fiddler played, the cider was poured, the plates were passed. Lavinia stood up with her cider raised. She did not need to ring a glass. The room quieted for her, the way rooms quiet for women who have been quieting rooms for 20 years. "Friends," she said, "neighbors, before we eat, a toast." She turned and looked down the long table to where Hattie sat between Willa and Tommy. "To our newest neighbor," Lavinia said. our brave little chicken widow, who has promised us so very much. We do all hope she lasts until spring." The hall laughed. It was the small, polite laugh of people who had been told what the joke was and did not want to be the ones not laughing. Lavinia waited until the laugh had run its course. "And dear Caleb," she said, "we are all so curious whether the bank will need to step in before Easter. My husband is quite the patient man, but even his patience has its winter." She raised her cider an inch higher. "To the new Mrs. Renner, in any case, whatever may come." She drank. Hattie sat with her hands folded in her lap. The wooden egg was in her apron pocket. She felt the weight of it against her hip. Caleb was sitting at her left elbow. She did not have to look at him to know his jaw had locked. She did not look at him. She did not want him to do anything. She turned her head 1 inch toward Willa, who had gone very still, and she said quietly, "Sweetheart, go and stand by your father's coat. I'll fetch you in a moment." Willa got up. She took Tommy's hand. They walked together down the long side of the hall toward the row of coats hung on pegs by the back door, and Tommy did not look up from the floor as they went. Hattie stood. She picked up the tray of biscuits beside her plate. She walked the length of the table with the tray in her hands. She set it down at the head of the table in front of Lavinia Trumbull. She did not speak. She turned. She walked back through the kitchen door at the side of the hall. And she did the next thing, which was to find her coat on the kitchen peg and to put it on and to button it. Caleb was already at the children. He had their coats. He was buttoning Tommy's collar. The 4 of them walked out the side door of the church together. The wagon was at the rail. Ezra had been waiting in it with a buffalo robe across his lap. He took 1 look at their faces, and he did not say anything. He clucked at the bay. They drove home through the dark and the cold. Willa cried halfway home. She cried quietly, with her face turned into Hattie's shoulder under the robe. Tommy did not cry. He sat very straight between his father and Hattie and held Hattie's hand in both of his. "What's for clothes?" he said. "Where did you hear that word, sweetheart?" At the table, the lady said, "foreclose." "It is a word about money," Hattie said. "It does not concern you." "It means they take it," Willa said into Hattie's shoulder. "I know what it means." "It does not concern you," Hattie said again. "Either of you." Tommy nodded slowly. He kept hold of her hand the rest of the way home. At Lark Hollow, she put the children to bed. She heated milk on the stove. She brought it to them in tin cups. She sat with Willa until the girl's breathing slowed and her hand loosened in Hattie's. And then she sat with Tommy across the small back room, and Tommy fell asleep with his fingers wrapped around the cuff of her sleeve. She unhooked his fingers gently. She drew the quilt up over him. She went out to the kitchen. Caleb was at the kitchen table. He had not taken his coat off. His hat was beside him on the table. She walked past him. She went to her room. She pulled the small trunk out from under the bed. She did not pack the trunk. She set it on the bed. She lifted the lid. She took the wooden egg out of her apron pocket, and she laid it in the center of the empty trunk on the cotton lining. She stood and looked at it. She stood there a long time. She thought about her mother Pearl in the Cedar County kitchen 40 years ago, with that same wooden egg in her hand, settling a broody Plymouth Rock back onto a nest. She thought about Reuben in the spring field with the plow horse. She thought about her own boots on the platform at Bitter Fork in October. She thought about Willa with the tin cup of water in the dooryard and Tommy asleep against her side on the wagon ride back from the Voss place, and Caleb in the kitchen doorway with his arm half in his sleeve, looking at 23 brown eggs lined up on a dish towel. She thought about Eliza Renner dying in the next room 4 years ago in January. She thought about the 4 tough hens who had outlived 60 better ones. She picked up the wooden egg out of the trunk. She held it in her palm. She put it back in her apron pocket. She closed the trunk. She slid it back under the bed. She walked out to the kitchen. She crossed to the wood stove. She opened the door. She added a piece of split pine to the bed of coals. She added another piece on top of it. One board, then the next board. She closed the stove. She turned around. Caleb was watching her from the table. "Don't go," he said. 2 words, nothing else. "I wasn't going to." He looked at his hands on the table. He nodded once. She crossed to the wash basin. She picked up the wooden egg out of her apron pocket. She set it back on the windowsill, in the exact place above the basin where she had put it the day she arrived, and the lamplight from the kitchen lamp caught the pale ash and made it look almost lit from inside. She turned down the lamp. She went to her room. She slept that night the way a woman sleeps who has decided. The blizzard came in on the night of January the 11th. Hattie had been ready for it since November. She did not know the date it would come. She knew only that it would come, and that when it did, the hens would have one chance, and one chance only. And that chance would depend entirely on whether she had done the work in the warm months that the cold months would demand of her. She had done the work. The coop walls were doubled with hay between the planks. The south foundation was banked 3 bales deep with straw. The pop door had its hinged cover. The waterer sat on its warmed sand pan. There was a small kerosene barn lantern on a wire from the rafter that she had been lighting at nightfall for the last 6 weeks, on the theory that an hour of false light at evening kept the hens believing in the day and laying through the cold. She had laid in 3 extra weeks of cracked corn. She had laid in 4 extra weeks of oyster shell. She had laid in lamp oil. She had laid in a sack of dried mealworms from the Voss place, because hens need fat in the cold, and mealworms were fat. She had laid in nothing for herself. She had not laid in twice over for the hens. The sky on the 11th was the color of a coal bucket bottom by 3 in the afternoon. The wind came at 4. The snow came at 5. By 6, the dooryard was gone, and the barn was a gray shape. And by 8, the world outside the kitchen window was a white roar. She and Caleb went out together at 9. They roped themselves to the kitchen door with a length of hemp she had set aside that morning. They walked sideways into the wind to the coop. She lit the lantern inside. She counted. 53 hens, all on the perches, all eyes bright. The waterer ice-rimmed, but not frozen through. She checked the pop door cover. She checked the feed. She walked back along the rope to the kitchen. Caleb shut the door behind them and threw the bolt. "How many?" he said. "All 53. They'll lay tomorrow." He stood at the kitchen door with snow melting in his hair. "You knew it was coming." "I knew it was coming sometime," she said. "I did not know it was coming tonight. The work is the same either way." He looked at her a long moment. "Yes," he said, "it is. The hens laid 31 eggs the first morning of the storm." Hattie collected them in the gray half-light, with the lantern hung on its wire and the wind screaming against the doubled south wall, and she carried them in along the rope. and she set them on the kitchen table, and Willa counted them out loud in 3 rows on the dish towel, while the storm went on outside, as if it meant to go on forever. It went on 3 days. On the 2nd day, at noon, someone pounded on the kitchen door. Caleb opened it. Martha Kyle half fell into the kitchen out of the white. Her shawl was frozen stiff. Her hands had gone the gray-white of cold that has stopped being painful, which is the dangerous kind. Behind her in the dooryard, her buckboard stood half buried, the horse blowing and stamping. "The boarding house woodpile," Martha said through cracked lips. "It went under a drift the first night. I have 11 boarders and a cold stove, and I did not know where else. Hattie was already moving." She got Martha into the chair by the stove. She pulled the frozen shawl off her and wrapped her in the wool blanket from her own bed. She put Martha's gray hands into a basin of water she warmed, degree by degree, the way you warm a frozen hand so the blood does not come back too fast and kill it. She poured hot coffee. She did not say anything about Christmas. She did not say anything about freezing. When Martha could feel her fingers again, she looked up at Hattie with her eyes wet, and not from the cold. "I was wrong," Martha said. "I told you you'd freeze by Christmas. I have been 41 years in this country, and I was wrong, and you were right, and I am sorry. You drink your coffee. Martha, you ought to say it. You ought to say, 'I told you so.'" "I have no use for it," Hattie said. "Caleb will load your buckboard with split pine, and you will take 24 eggs to your boarders, and you will come back when the storm breaks for more. That is the use I have for it." Caleb loaded the buckboard with a 1/4 cord of split pine roped down under a tarp. Hattie packed 24 eggs in a basket of straw. Martha drove away into the lull between the worst of the wind, and she lifted one frozen hand off the reins to wave, and Hattie raised her own hand at the door. On the 2nd evening, Doc Harrow came on horseback, his collar iced to his beard. "The Voss boy has pneumonia," he said before he was through the door, "and my own wife. I have been 4 hours getting to 3 houses, and I cannot get back to town against this wind tonight. And I have no broth and no eggs, and half the town's hens are dead in their coops as we speak." "Sit down, doctor," Hattie said. He sat. She fed him. She sent him back out at first light with a covered pail of broth and 24 eggs packed in straw and a sack of cracked corn for the Voss flock, if any of it had lived. At the door he stopped. He was a man who had read books and wanted you to know it. And what it cost him to say the next thing was plain on his face. "Hens do not lay below 35 degrees, he said. "That is the science. I told you that in the Mercantile in October. And you have 53 hens laying through the worst blow in 12 winters, and I cannot account for it by any science I was taught." He looked at her. "Iowa hens or no, Mrs. Crane, you have kept them laying. I owe you that admission, and I make it freely." "It is not the hens, doctor," Hattie said. "It is the work. Get the broth to your wife while it's hot." On the 3rd day, the Reverend Finch came. His sleigh foundered in a drift a half-mile down the road. Walking the last of it, he came not to counsel her and not to warn her. He came because Lark Hollow had a fire and a roof, and he could not reach his own. Hattie took him in. She gave him the chair by the stove. She gave him soup. He warmed his hands, and he looked at the children playing jackstraws on the kitchen floor, and at the baskets of eggs lined up on the sideboard, and at the woman moving steady between the stove and the table. And after a long while he said, quietly, to no one in particular, "Some things require living through to be understood." Hattie ladled him a second bowl of soup. "They do, Reverend," she said. "Eat." The wind died at 2 a.m. on the 4th night. She knew the moment it died, because the silence woke her. After 3 days of roar, the stillness came down like a weight, and she lay in the dark in her small room and listened to it. And then she heard, under the silence, the sound of Tommy crying. She got up. She went to the children's room. Tommy was sitting up in the bed. Willa was awake beside him, very still, the way Willa went still. "What is it, sweetheart?" "Papa's not here," Tommy said. "Papa went out before the dark, and he didn't come back. I waked up, and his bed is empty, and he didn't come back." Hattie went to the back room. Caleb's bed was made and cold. His coat was gone from the peg. His boots were gone, she thought, fast and clear, the way her mother had taught her to think when there was no time to be afraid.